Right, I can see the record button.
We are now.
Yeah, great.
There's on the right hand side, there's a reference to the journeys that we created in the original official running of the project, and we'll talk you through how you can access those later in the session. It's interesting. I got.
Yes, it's a little slow loading, that's all.
Okay. So Lillian usually does a summary of what people, a bit of analysis of what people said they wanted to learn.
Yeah, so we've got 137 people signed up for this webinar, and most people have said they're curious about inclusive practice in assessments, but other things that people have said that they want to find out in this session: new ways to deliver assessment that aren't exams or recall of facts, alternatives to essays apart from video recordings, various methods of creating appropriate, authentic, and inclusive assessment opportunities. What is it that makes assessment inclusive? What does electronic assessment look like in the post-COVID university and further education? Remote assessment methods or ways of assessing critical thinking. How to support colleagues in writing and designing assessments. Ideas for improving assessments, and how assessments can help learners understand their own development needs, and then reducing burden of or the workload of assessments. So yeah, those are some things that we are going to be covering, and some things we covered in our last webinar, but Alistair will talk through some of those things and where you can find those resources.
That's a very good summary of 137 bullet points there. Excellent. And some of those elements about inclusive assessment, what constitutes inclusive and so on, some of those will come out not just with the presenters, not just with the existing resources, but also in the discussion, because it's a big area, and so there's plenty of opportunity for discussion. So this is just to remind you that you'll notice if you look down the bottom right hand side of my screen at the moment, it's saying 27 out of 37, because we're starting towards the end. We've tagged this onto the end of the original resource. So it's just to pick out for you some of the key elements of the original resource that you might want to look back at. I won't click on all of these, but these are some when you look at it yourself. And one of my colleagues will pop the link into the chat pane in a minute. This resource is a really rich resource. It's got the recording of the 2018 session where we go through all the different pages, all those other sort of 30 odd pages with content and activities. One thing particularly worth looking at is the mind map, which you can see here. There's a lot of elements where we've mapped out different parts that we've covered through the session and given you a big conceptual overview. So that's a good starting point. There's some interesting elements on defining what we mean by appropriate. So, for example, on that particular page, that should have gone straight there. Again, we talk about, appropriate. It's about inclusive. It's about rigorous. It's about equivalent. It's about authentic. It's even about kind of culture, creating a culture of lifelong learning. So there's elements there that I think are worth looking at. We've got research articles bringing you up to date with a wide range of research on assessment types and so on. Lillian created a nice assessment walkthrough, again with lots of links. So going through the process from number one, working through what you're going to do, preparing students, and then through the end to kind of looking at assessment when conventional exams aren't possible. So there's a nice staged opportunity there with loads of links for you to explore. We've got examples of good and bad practice on question readability. I like these. These are from the Fair Access by Design guidance, by the Welsh Qualifications Authority, but just some really simple basic stuff that is so easy to get wrong when you're writing multi-choice examples. For example, poor sentence structure, there's a better example. We've got a whole list of these as well. Poor, how would you improve it? A really nice exercise to do with colleagues. Come up with some improvements, check to see how you do. And then a couple of last things there, going beyond multiple choice, because obviously assessment isn't just about quizzes by any means, and we're talking about all sorts of things today, but quizzes can form a part of it because they can be self-marked. But how can you go beyond multiple choice to multiple true and false, assertion reasoning questions, and then matching questions? And so those are really interesting pedagogical techniques that we do encourage you to go back and look at. And then the thing that's probably of most interest to most people is reducing the burden of assessment. And we've got a Padlet, link to a Padlet there, where people have been putting all sorts of ideas on the ways you can reduce the burden of assessment for you, or indeed for your learners. So after this session, we'd invite you to keep accessibility and inclusion at the forefront as you explore the new approaches. Try some new approaches. That's the really important thing from these sessions. Go and try. And then a couple of ideas about how you might check accessibility of an online resource, a couple of sort of basic things to check, and then share your experiences on the Future Teacher mailing list. So now we're over to the first of our speakers. And Lillian, do you want to introduce Scott? You're muted.
Yes, so Scott is my colleague at the University of York in the school, in the law school, York Law School, and I persuaded him to join us to share what he does in law school, what they do in law school, to provide more inclusive assessments where students have a little bit of choice. So over to you, Scott, when you're ready. Brilliant. Yep, we can see your slides.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Scott. I'm the Director of Learning Teaching at York Law School. Designing appropriate assessments is a cathartic experience for me because I, during my degree at apparently one of the world's premier universities, I did 164 essays in the space of 3 years in terms of both learning and assessment, and I haven't written one since. So what I look to do is to provide a means of students demonstrating not just what they've picked up in terms of knowledge from their modules, but more importantly, to be able to show relevant skills that we want them to develop over the course of a program. So the assessment I'll take you through is in third year. The law school program is heavily founded in problem-based learning. And so what we want to do within the module is, as I said, to look at how students can continue to develop problem-based learning skills and advance those skills and then assess those, deal with more complex scenarios in terms of facts, issues and law. And then importantly, I think for year 3, there's always the idea of capstone modules or dissertations and so on. But conceptually, I think in year 3, students should be able to, having done 2 years of a degree, they should have room to flourish. They should be able to explore their interests. They should be able to take things in directions that they want to take in terms of their learning at the time and in terms of their future learning. And so to that extent, what we want to do is to look at the extent to which students in year 3 can also personalise the curriculum, personalise the assessment, whilst continuing to demonstrate relevant module and programme learning outcomes. So what we do is a little bit like this. We provide a 2-part assessment. And the first part is common to students. in the sense of they are asked to do the same thing. So they work in what we call a student law firm of 10 to 12 students. In years 1 and 2, they have a weekly PBL cycle, and here we're giving them a more complex problem to deal with. And over a period of 4 weeks, they work together to analyse the problem. They then independently carry out research based on that analysis. They apply problem-solving skills. They discuss it when they come back, having done some research. They refine their findings and their analysis of the problem. And then they evaluate the position of the relevant parties brought up in that problem. So what you see on screen is about half of the problem. Down the side, there are prompts as to different legal issues, different areas of law we expect students to work towards. And the end point is that individually they need to put together a final report in a particular format of their analysis of that problem. So in that sense, it's a common assessment. And as to pick up the point in the chat, it's a summative assessment, and it's 30% of the it's 30% of their final mark in this in this module. So that gets them about 45% of the way through this particular 10-week module. The relevance of this stage, as well as the development of the PBL skills, is it introduces them into a multiplicity of issues and a multiplicity of areas of law. Some of them will be previously learned, some of them will be new. And this is where it becomes more personal. So based on that scenario, students are allowed to propose 2 outputs. They have to be capable of demonstrating the relevant module learning outcomes, which are based around being able to research particular areas of law, explain issues within that area of law, being able to communicate to different audiences, to show perspectives on law, and so on. They propose those 2 outputs to their tutor and their peers in one of the workshops, and explain how they will meet the relevant module learning outcomes, how they will be able to, how they have the substance to fulfill sort of around 80 notional learning hours in terms of the research and the preparation of these outputs. There's an overall word limit. There's a requirement that the 2 outputs be in different formats, which I'll come to shortly, and they should address different audiences. And these 2 outputs together will count for 70% of the final module mark. So from about halfway through the module, the workshops then become surgeries. So students are expected to be working on developing these outputs. They come to the workshops, they can sit and they can work on these outputs. The tutor will go around and have one-to-ones with the students. We have set peer review workshops as well, where they present their work in progress to their colleagues and get feedback. And then finally, at the end of the module, they'll submit those 2 outputs. So we provide students with ideas and examples of what those outputs could be. I won't run through all of these, but you'll see there is a very broad range from very traditional articles, essays, and so on, through to very creative pieces, which are very different in format, and even through, in some cases, to setting up and preparing your own problem, and then preparing an output based on your own problem. What we do, and again, I won't run through this in detail, is in the student handbook, as well as giving them some ideas about potential outputs, we then explain what these things would actually consist of. So here's one for putting a pitch towards a law and action programme. The previous one was a submission to parliamentary committee. And then what an op-ed piece would be. And that's because we found that whilst giving students a sort of open field, is a good thing. Sometimes it panics students, and they do want more guidance as to what things might appear in that open field. So why is that less boring than setting an essay? Well, it gives students freedom, I think, to explore interests. It gives them a stake in both designing their own assessment, but it also directs their attention to the module and programme learning outcomes, because they have to design their assessment in line with those. And whilst we all spend a lot of time and effort putting together module and programme learning outcomes, I'm not always convinced the extent to which students actually engage with them. So this is a means of actually doing that. So to sort of run through from stage 1 to stage 2 and try and simultaneously pick up some of the points in chat, which are coming through. In terms of the cohort size, it's the entire year. So it'd be around 180 to 200 students will take this module. It's compulsory, but there's a choice, and we have different themes. So we have one module which is around a corporate commercial scenario, one which is more around litigation, employment dispute and discrimination scenario. We have one which involves counter-terrorism and media. We have one which is involved with criminal law and also the law as applies to children. So every student must take one of these modules, because particularly because of the PBL element. So it's compulsory, but there's a choice. There's a collaborative element, which is part of our overall approach at the law school. But there remains the independent elements of research and writing. It's very applied, and the output is something which is not an essay. It's a practical report. It's very efficient to mark because everybody is moving towards the same thing. On stage 2, there's the student choice, and therefore there's inclusivity in the sense that students can choose what they want to be assessed in and on, and in terms of the format. And there's also the support with that provided by the surgeries and the workshops as we go through. In terms of standardized marking, we provide to tutors and students an explanation of how the module learning outcomes should be assessed. So we explain how these are demonstrated, or how best they can be demonstrated, and that allows marking on this standardized basis in terms of how do the outputs meet the relevant criteria. So to that extent, we do have a unified rubric that applies to them all. We're in the 3rd year of this. Students are coming up with very interesting outputs, and we feel that it does provide a means of moving away from the traditional essay format to have something that's more relevant both individually and in terms of the outputs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's going to be lots of questions coming in here, which is great. Keep questions coming in, folk, because we're going to go straight on now to Ismini. And,
yep.
And as we do that, Scott will be in the background able to pick up on your questions. So, Lillian, to you again.
Yeah, so just introducing Ismini from my alma mater, De Montfort Uni, although at the time it was called Leicester Polytechnic all those years ago. And Ismini is associate professor and also associate head of school at the School of Computer Science and Informatics at De Montfort University, Leicester. And she's going to share with us some of her experiences working with her colleagues to promote assessment literacy as well. Over to you, Ismini.
Thank you for the introduction, Lillian. Very good to be with you today. Right, self-play from start. So yes, I've been asked to join this webinar today, and I'm taking a bit of a different approach. I am an academic myself. I've been teaching for over 15 years now in higher education, and I have experienced the didactic approach, the blended learning approach, and it's been in my practice, in my module, it's been over 10 years where I flipped the classroom. It was at the time when I first did it, it was a really, really big challenge to convince my seniors to flip the classroom. But at the end of it, of the pilots, it became a school-wide approach and then an institutional approach. So I was delivering lots of workshops on how people can do it. Now, as you can see from my title, I've got managing teams during crisis, and I've got managing into quotes. I don't like referring to myself as I'm managing people. I'm more of a teams person. I'm there to support my colleagues. I'm there to go beyond and above in what I can offer, and I go against one size fits all. So hopefully with the presentation today, I'm gonna share with you some reflections I've gathered through my practice and how I applied all this with my staff and what we managed to achieve. I am a reflective person in my practice, and this is what I try to bring into my teams as well. I try not to impose what I have done into my modules. I've got a computer science background. I've always taught really hands-on modules, really practical modules. And I've been staying away from essay type of assignments as well. So it's more about doing, more about learning together. The past 1 year, I haven't seen for my colleagues for a whole year. I haven't really seen my students for a year. And although I tried to see COVID as an opportunity, at the same time, it really gave me time to reflect on my practice. And I tried to embed this into my staff's thinking as well. So this is a set of questions that I would suggest you can take it away in your teams. Think about where we are now. We're all talking about a post-COVID era already. You know, the year is gone. We've got the vaccinations. We are looking at how higher education is going to look at when we're out of this situation. But also, how do we get here? And I'm not talking about how the pandemic occurred, but we're all using online learning, remote learning. We're all using technology so much these days. And it really makes you think, why did we not do it until now? The technology has been there. In the past 1 year, at least at the Montford, and I'm sure in other places as well, we haven't really used a set of technology that was not there before. We either expanded on it, or we improved it, or we just we figured out there was more opportunities with what we had in place already. And things we need to start thinking is, have we been inclusive all this time and diverse? Are we giving equal opportunities to everyone? And of course, the consequences of the digital divide. For the last two, I will say there are no real answers. And I don't think this session or the next 1 to 6 months are going to provide us with answers, but it's really good questions that we can take away, start reflecting on them, and start designing those kind of strategies that will open up those opportunities. So since last year, overnight, when we went into lockdown, we had to teach remotely, and it was absolutely amazing that we witnessed staff who could even being reluctant in the past to use technology, to grasp into this new idea, and they felt comfortable using it. We were able to manage online classrooms, we were able to provide feedback, we were able to produce electronic assessments, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, we had to deal with caring responsibilities, maybe the bad network or any other technical difficulties. So it has been a really huge challenge. And all this happened overnight. And I'm hoping that nobody is going to forget how much we achieved as a team overnight a year ago. As I said, I do come from computer science. You can see my Twitter handle is Geek Ismini, so I do consider myself very nerdy. And I have been so much involved on how quickly the industry has been changing the past few years. And this is why, again, I'm going to say it's not one size fits all. higher education has a tendency to stay a bit behind quite often. The industry is quite ahead. Of course, sometimes it depends on the type of the discipline and the type of the industry. But in the computing field, we do see this very often, that the graduates we produce sometimes might not have that lifelong learning skill that we want them to have. So Industry 4 has been affecting us quite a lot, and it has influenced higher education in many ways. So we have seen the use of technology to have improved. We are all able to provide assessments online. We provide feedback. We do the marking online. And we need to start looking at how we can invest on the digital skills for staff. We need to start looking possibly at local level, the teams we are managing, the teams we are supporting, the discipline and the field we're in, and how we can create that set of skills that people need in higher education. Gosh, I'm stressing out. So learning analytics is something really important, and it's something we can start looking at within our practice, how we can start personalizing the sessions, the feedback, how we can start becoming more adaptive and agile in what we do. So the learning of the future, I would say it looks like that. It has to be more flexible. It doesn't matter if you've got 500 students in your class. I've always taught really big groups because database development, for example, is really core module across the computing field. It has to have this element of personalization, so you understand the student you've got in front of you. But also what's very important is develop the curriculum, develop your assessment in an adaptable way. So if there's an industry influence, if something has happened in the real world, how can you embed this into your assessment, into your teaching and learning practice? So we need to start becoming more agile. And this means, of course, that the institution has become more agile, but you can start by applying these principles, this framework within your local teams. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm more than happy to share my slides, or if people want to speak to me after the end of this session. I've been looking at the Blue Taxonomy and how you can, a very familiar framework to most of us that we have been using for a number of years. How can we transform what we have been delivering, either on a blended environment or an online environment? What you will notice on that table is that group work and the group coursework and the group components is really evident there, really present. And I have quite often I see colleagues saying that inclusive assessment means if an individual is having learning difficulties or any other needs and they want to work alone in an assignment, that's what we should do. And I truly disagree with that. Through my practice over the years, inclusive assessment is how can we make those students feel included in what we teach? How can we understand their needs? And how can we support them to integrate into the society? I mean, I've been in academia for 20 years. I always have to work in teams. I've never worked alone. So that's the real world, isn't it? So how can we create those activities and those practices where everyone feels recognized and everyone feels that they are included within our education? So moving into the future, we have to develop a virtual culture. It is something the younger generation is using quite a lot. We see how comfortable and confident our students feel using social media, using online platforms. So why don't we use them in the future? We can be imaginative, we can be creative in our practice. We don't have to go down the route of another essay, another report. See our disciplines, see how they do it in the real world, and try to apply those frameworks and those principles within our everyday practice. Being inclusive and diverse is absolutely crucial, and that does not mean excluding someone by giving them their own assignment, their own assignment spec to work with. It should be exactly the other way around. Oh, we're running out of time. So we need to empower motivation, but we also need to look after the well-being of our staff and our students. So my suggestions in the post-COVID era would be remove the exams. The exams are just assessing someone there and then. They're not having that holistic approach. Flipping the classroom, whether it's online or it's face-to-face, I will empower the agility. It can combine the online support and the distance learning, invest on learning environments, and invest on technology. And very quickly, I'm currently teaching Agile Development. And what you will see is on the top of I've got my content is the slides I'm creating, and I'm pre-recording my slides. At the bottom is the coursework that I have already issued, and I work with a student, but I'm also using the LinkedIn learning platform. So I embed those industrial standards and frameworks from the start in my module. And I do apologize for the typo I just noticed on the LinkedIn learning platform. So it's really crucial that the students realize that if they go out there in the real world, this is how they will be applying their learning, and this is how they will have to grasp the new concepts. This is a master's level, so you do expect the students to become more independent. So the advice is you build that gradually into your teaching and learning and your assessment from day one, from level 4 all the way to level 7 to master's level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ismini. I think we've had to make you pack quite a lot into 10 minutes. We will have time for questions after our final speaker, Sally from Nottingham. And Sally's going to talk us through something that she has had published recently. So it'll be a slightly different format. Is it Ron? Are you sharing screen so we can see? Yeah, and Sally's on video as well. So just to give you a bit of background about Sally there. So over to you, Sally.
Okay, hi, I'm Sally. I work in the Learning Technologies team at the University of Nottingham. I've worked there in media-related roles for about 20 years. So I've seen sort of how this idea of students submitting media for assessment has developed over time. I did notice that one of the questions or one of the outcomes that someone typed into the form before this session was alternative assessment, but not video, which struck me as quite an interesting comment, that video was something that they didn't think was something they wanted to consider. And I thought that was quite interesting why that would be. At Nottingham, similarly to what Scott was talking about, we've also had a number of our academic staff engage with innovative forms of assessment that were a little bit wider than media. So historically, we've had people using assessment where there is no real restriction on the subject matter, except that it is encompassing something that was taught within the module. And no real restriction on the format. So in some of those scenarios, students have been able to submit things like websites, links to websites that they've created, or artwork, and all sorts of other things. I do actually have on my blog a link to one of our academic staff talking about her experience of delivering a module like that, a second year module in classics with about 40 students on it, where there was this requirement to choose your own format. And sometimes students are a little uncomfortable with that. We've also got scenarios where the subject matter is free form, so you can choose a subject matter surrounding the subject. So in Russian, for example, Russian history, the students were guided to choose a particular something that happened in Russian history as their subject matter that they covered in their course, in their module, but the format had to be a podcast, so they were recording audio for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the drivers behind why I've seen an increase in adoption of media assignment by staff. And I think some of that is to do with this fear that students are losing the motivation, in part due to what's happened with lockdown. So students feeling isolated, and in one of our recent surveys, a large proportion of students describe motivation as a disruptive factor. in their studies, which is quite worrying. So there was a desire to kind of address that as well. And in the recent GISC Student Digital Capabilities report, because we did the Student Digital Capabilities Survey at Nottingham, digital creation and media literacy skills of our students were rated quite low, but with the alumni group that we surveyed, the importance in their job of those kinds of skills was higher. So I'm going to talk a bit about having explored the pedagogy behind why you might choose to use video assignment or any kind of media assignment. It might be audio, it might be a presentation with audio, or just animation even. So part of the driver for that is developing skills. So I think Scott did actually say that that was part of what he was looking for in his students' submissions, that they demonstrate that the student has developed some skills in an area that maybe is a new challenge for them. And both of those things are useful in the workplace. So they're useful in the workplace because you're going to have to develop new skills quickly, and you're going to have to respond to new challenges in the workplace. There was also a feeling that there was a need to invigorate assessments. There was too many students who felt that they were just doing too much writing and exams. It was writing exams, writing exams. But then there were other students who needed to be persuaded of the value of doing something different like video. And there was that fear among students of not having the technical skills to be able to actually fulfill the requirements. And having the topics flexible had both plus and minus points. So on the plus side, it meant that the students could choose something that they were very engaged with. But on the downside, it might be too much choice, and they might not be able to actually focus on one particular aspect. There was a feeling that this allowed them, in fact, some of the assignments were specifically about reflection, and that they were more authentic, more like real life kinds of activities that students might need to do. Now, one of the questions that Alistair did actually ask me was about accessibility of these types of assessments. So I did actually ask some of the staff that I've worked with about whether they felt that these were helpful, these types of assessment were helpful for students who don't prefer writing. And they unanimously responded that they felt that students who didn't prefer the writing opportunity, it gave the students who didn't prefer writing an opportunity to show the skills that they have, and almost provided more of a level playing field for those students. So there's been quite a bit of talk in the chat about marking guidance. Hazel particularly has picked up on that and emphasised the importance of linking that to learning objectives, and I think that is something that we do need to be aware of, that the marker and the student need to both fully understand what it is that's being marked here. So we have an example from geography, and I've actually posted in the blog a link to some of the examples of video submissions from a very long time ago, when it wasn't quite so easy to create and submit media, and how the students have been very creative in what they've submitted. So they were given a choice of different ways of submitting, different types of video they could create, and they've embraced that. But the marker did actually specify that she would be marking, and 20% of the mark for that assessment would be for creativity. So that idea of having it very clearly stated what element of it is going to be marked as the actual subject matter, and which part of it is going to include marking for the skills that you've developed in creating and working with the video itself. We also found that there were challenges with external examiners who often did not have much of an idea about how they could even assess whether this marking is fair or not. So the clear marking rubric is absolutely crucial, and often including that term creativity, but very, very clear about what part of the mark is assigned to that. There is obviously a challenge when you're marking or separating out the demonstration of the learning from the medium. So a flashy, well-produced video is not necessarily always better. There's also some kind of risk, acknowledged risk there for the person who's setting it, so for the teacher, in that it can include a lot of support for the students that they may not have anticipated. So what we've tried to do is to put in place good student support mechanisms, including our service desk being fully aware of all of the published support for students creating and submitting media for assessment. We've recommended that staff set a formative test first, a very simple test that just make sure that students are able to actually create and submit the video in some way, or the media file in some way, so that they hit the problems in a low stakes environment before it's high stakes. Also, you need to think about the technical resources, both for creation of the video and the infrastructure back-end resources. So those videos go somewhere. They may go in your own infrastructure, in which case you could run out of disk space quite easily on servers, or they may be in a software as a service infrastructure, in which case you could find yourself having some kind of unexpected cost, which does not go down well if there's a sudden increase in adoption. So in the future, we are hoping to be a bit more joined up and strategic led in this respect. So at the moment, it's been individual module conveners who've chosen to do this, but the Student Digital Capability Report led to us submitting a report to our Teaching and Learning Committee at the university, which was entitled Student Digital Capabilities, Filling Gaps in Provision of Support. And one of the recommendations of that is that rich media production should be part of the taught curriculum. Sorry, that was my own time. Thank you. Thanks for listening. And please do read the blog post.
And it was perfect timing. Thank you very much. So we now have Ron taking us over onto the next part.
Well, not really, Alistair. It's all of us, isn't it?
Well,
so
that's
if
true,
we
that's true, yeah.
invite our guest speakers to turn on their videos and microphones again, and I guess this is an example of, kind of mixed communication formats in a way, because there's been loads of activity in the text chat, but maybe there's some key questions that people want to, some of our delegates want to open their mics and ask verbally. So Lil and Alistair, if you can turn your videos on as well. And if there's anything that wasn't answered in the text chat that we should pick up on again, or if there are new questions to ask, then please do so. And we obviously have 90 odd people in the room. We can't all have our microphone and video showing, but if anyone wants to pose their question via their mic, then please do.
Yeah, I think there's been a very, very interesting debate going on in the chat about how possible or not possible it is to provide people with the freedom of assessment versus how you would make that possible if you have large numbers of students, versus whether you would have external examiners happy with a total choice of assessments, etc. And I think we need to kind of think about it in levels and not think it's all or nothing. And I think, for instance, one of my answers to the thread in the chat, and Scott will be able to turn on his mic and confirm, this idea that I thought what was interesting with Scott's module was the fact that it's confined. There is a little bit of a confinement to written outputs, communicating to diverse audiences through written outputs. So we're not talking about choice in that you can perform a dance to explain this point of law, because it wouldn't meet the purpose of what a student might be expected to do when they went and worked in a law firm. Scott, over to you.
Yes, I think that's right, and it's interesting, the question of the chat, that there's the realities of doing this in terms of the marking, the QA aspects, in terms of equivalence. And so I think to that extent, you are always putting boundaries on in order to make sure that things work. And I think something to maybe something to think about is the fact that there are a number of control points as you go. So at the point the student makes the proposal, then there is the ability there for the tutor to be assured and to help steer the student to ensure that what they're proposing is capable of meeting the module learning outcomes. The surgery aspect and the feedback as you go through the module, it's the same as a dissertation, in the sense that you're trying to guide a student towards doing something that will be a half-decent dissertation. And in the same way, the feedback as you go through the module will help the student ensure that what they produce is capable, and again is in alignment with the module learning outcomes. It shouldn't be a surprise or a trick to try and get the students to align the module and program learning outcomes. And then the third element is on certain formats. For example, some students have done a presentation to the board of a company about a redundancy program. If the students provided just the slides, you could find them in various places. You could put together a series of bullet points, and that you can't test the depth of understanding. So what the tutors will do, if it's like a shorter finished product, they will ask the students for example, a PowerPoint to complete the notes element, basically to show the depth of understanding that's going into that presentation. So again, we can ensure equivalent, both that they meet the module learning outcomes, and also equivalence in terms of what students are doing intellectually to get to that point of producing the output.
Thank you.
I'm finding it very interesting. There's a lot of lots of comments about the need to take students outside of their comfort zone, so the students don't just choose the same thing all the time, and don't avoid the skills that they feel less capable of doing, because a part of education is definitely to be stretched, to be challenged, and to increase your skill set. But it's interesting that those arguments tend to come to the fore much more when we're talking about moving away from the current process. And I think you could very strongly argue that the current process is extremely unbalanced. The current norm, I think, Scott, you said at the beginning there was 134 or something essays you wrote, and so it's not as if we're going from a position where people are getting lots of good challenges in lots of good areas and we're trying to do something radical. I think the speakers we've had today, they are radical, but in a way they shouldn't be. They should be the norm at moving people away from this text monoculture, which has infected higher education and further education for many years.
That's also quite an interesting question there about would you show students previous examples if they asked for them? Certainly in the assessment that I described, that the teacher's talking in the video on the blog post, there's a resource that I posted. She collects them, and that's a resource that's available to all the students. I'm not sure why you wouldn't, unless you fear some form of plagiarism, potential plagiarism there.
The plagiarism is an interesting one that I think people might have views on, because I'm not aware of a Turnitin for podcasts or a Turnitin for video clips. Any comments on that, anyone?
I can say something about that.
Yep.
It's a very interesting thing to think about plagiarism. So what I used to do when I was teaching database development, I used to give them a group assignment that was a real world problem, and I wasn't delivering any lectures or anything. So we're using Oracle in that module, which is one of the biggest organizations in databases. And they had to build that project with me. It was in the lab, I would have about 60 students, and I was supporting them to learn rather than to teach them the principles of database development. We also have Stack Overflow. I don't know if there's any other computer scientists on this call, where the industry is using Stack Overflow quite a lot. There's online forums there, and people can post questions in how do you write this script and that script. And I had many students that would post on there with the assignment spec. And because I use it, for other things as well, I would go next day in the class and say, oh, by the way, one of your classmates, you may find some answers. But because it was the focus of the assignment was so much on, we need to understand what we need to develop. And the students were asked from day one, that's what I said about getting the students to work together, integrate them into the real world. There was no way they could plagiarize. And the beauty was I could reuse that scenario year after year because there was no one solution to it. So even if they could reuse a script they found online, I don't see a problem with that because that's the industry, isn't it? So
yeah, I think what's an interesting extension of that, Ismini, and I've seen very many assessment experts you mention this, that what you could do is set the assignment where people do go into Stack Overflow and try to get 2 or 3 different approaches to coding and solving a problem, and then write a critical analysis of whether one has benefits over another. That is what we're after, that critical thinking. So you can ask people for solutions, but can you think through whether that is an optimal solution? That is what your learning outcome should be checking. In a world where knowledge, it can just be searched for and asked for.
I think there's a really interesting overlap here between the ideas about plagiarism, and is plagiarism potentially a powerful learning tool that you can use, like Lillian's saying, go and find some essay mills and find three essays and then tell us which is the best one and why you rejected the others. But there's another element of that which I think comes back to the whole idea of, do you give students model essays? And I know when I was teaching A-level students to write long essays, and many of them found it incredibly difficult, I didn't give them a model answer because a model answer would be so out of most of their thinking framework when they started that it would be a source of fear rather than a source of support. So what I gave them is I gave them poor essays, and some of them I would make up myself, or I would take extracts from different things. But I would give them something and say, that's not very good. And the reason it's not very good is because of X, Y, or Z. And their task was to take that and do whatever X, Y, or Z was to make it better. So if they started with an E grade model essay, their task would be to make it a B grade. And that was much more successful in some ways at getting them to think through, okay, that's what a poor one looks like. That's what the kind I would do looks like. So how would a better one that I'm not yet there for, how would that look? And that was very successful.
You should be ringing your bell, Alistair, because we're running way.
I get so excited when
time.
Sorry, it's when we get into the debate and things. I just love it, and just reading what's on there. I've rung the bell, Ron. Carry on.
I'm just wondering, I've got a Zoom quit unexpectedly message in front of me. So am I still there?
Yes,
yeah, you're still there.
Yeah, just maybe a dodgy.
Well,
yeah. Oh, we have lost Ron. Now, this is scary because I was almost going to give Ron host access so he could carry on while I went
back.
for my 2 o'clock.
He's there, but he's muted. Still muted, Ron.
Yeah, you left the building for a few minutes, Ron. So, and I need to give you co-host access again, I think.
Well,
That's
hopefully,
it. Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
I'm back, and it did mute me again. So yeah, sorry for that. Just very quickly, while we're all still sharing our microphones and screen, I'll just quickly recap on the last few screens that we have, pages that we have. There's the summary of the journeys that we mentioned, and there's a step-by-step guide for those of you that haven't already done that, where you can sign up and access those journeys of all the topics that we've covered in all of the webinars. There's a page about us and our contact details. Next steps is the one that we always like to mention, that you've seen from 3 guest speakers today, and we'd be very keen to hear from you if you're interested in being a guest speaker on our next webinar, which is all about designing for technology enhanced programs, and that's on the 24th of May at 1 p.m. So if you're interested in being a guest speaker on that one, please contact us, and there's a link. There's also reference to our mailing list if you haven't already joined that. It's a low traffic mailing list, but it's where we'll post the recording link and so on. We ask everybody before you leave to reflect on what you've discussed today and share just one thing. You can't do that on my shared screen, but I'm sure Lillian or Alistair will put the link in the text chat where you can go direct to that and post your message.
I'll put it indirectly. Yeah.
And then very finally, we have a couple of last pages. One is just to reference the tool that we use to create this resources, certainly used for formative assessment, but can be used very cleverly for all sorts of other types of assessment as well. And there's a summary there about that. And on the last page, if you view this resource in your own time, there's a kind of a demonstration of one of the ways this can be used, in terms of there's a results page and you can download the results. So if you've missed resources or you've missed interactions, there's a kind of summary there that you can download and prompt. But we'll go back to the what one thing. And if it doesn't work for you, there's a link there, and I think Lillian's probably put it in the text chat. If that doesn't work, then just put your what one thing in the Zoom text chat instead. But the idea, and one of the reasons we use TextWall for doing this, is that you can reflect after the session, continue to post your thoughts on what you would do as a result of what we've discussed today, and then everyone can benefit from seeing those results as well. And if I switch to viewing the message, we'll see whether anyone has posted, and there's a couple there, and that should update live as well. So perhaps I'll open it in a new window just to see the messages, and we'll see those coming in. I'll open the text chat. There's quite a few updates in the text chat as well, I think. We always ask you to be quite specific in terms of those responses there. Everyone says review the resource and so on, but it's actions that we're keen for you, as Alistair mentioned earlier on, to go away and at least consider something, or perhaps do something differently as a result of what you've heard and discussed today, and the very active discussion in the text chat.
Yep, and we always say we shouldn't be afraid to be quiet while people are thinking and typing. Right, now, Ron, this is the scary bit, right? I'd like to thank all our speakers. I'd love to thank everyone that's contributed in the chat. I am going to stop the recording.